KBIA's News of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, remembering Prince for his music and the imprint he left on the way we consume media. Why Kelly Ripa took a few unscheduled days off from her syndicated ABC program, Live with Kelly and Michael, and we'll talk about a daring plan to cut commercials from Saturday Night Live by 30%. There's a lot more that we hope to get to as well before our time's up today, but we're going to start with what's looking more like a hostile takeover of Tribune Publishing by the newspaper giant Gannett. Tribune Publishing owns 11 newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, Hartford Courant, the Orlando Sentinel, and South Florida Sun Sentinel. That's in Fort Lauderdale. Well, Monday morning, Gannett, which owns 107 papers across the country, including the USA Today, it made an $815 million bid for Tribune, offering what amounts to about $12.25 per share. This comes just 2 months after Michael Farrow came in and bought a major ownership stake of Tribune and started making some very big changes there. Reports early this week made it sound like Farrow was none too pleased to receive the bid from Gannett, but then said would consider it, and there have been a lot of words going back and forth since then.
So that might be just negotiating tactics, trying to get a slightly higher offer from Gannett. I mean, what interests me is that if you'd said 5 years ago that Gannett was offering $815 million for all of Tribune's papers, you'd have gone, that's insanely low. Not so insanely low now. It's what, 5 or 6 times annual earnings, because the newspaper industry has cratered. So the big question is, why does one giant newspaper chain want to suck up one smaller newspaper chain at a time when revenues are down and layoffs are up, and it's uncertain where the audience is coming from in the future?
Well, you know, there's a reason why Gannett is called the Borg of newspaper journalism. I mean, they come in and they assimilate and they change it around to fit the Gannett structure.
The Indianapolis Star and Des Moines Register are almost
exactly, and
almost identical these days.
And I mean that same thing is happening in Wisconsin right now, because they just bought
the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and that parent company. And so I think what you're seeing here is that Gannett is taking advantage of the fact that, as you said, Mike, the fact that the Tribune is having financial difficulties. They can't even seem to find a good financial firm to do their finances right. I mean, it's been they fired PricewaterhouseCoopers, they hired somebody else, they're still having problems there. And part of the problem here is that the whole structure and the disruption of the newspaper industry has caused the Tribune and other companies to try to figure out, how do we manage through this? And Gannett is looking at this and saying, wait a minute, we have an opportunity to take over another company and expand our company and possibly be able to weather the disruption.
And this is a company, too, that has papers in major markets, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Baltimore. These are markets that Gannett really isn't in. There's much more. I mean, I mentioned Indianapolis, I mentioned Des Moines, much more middle markets, like large mid-majors.
Well, and the argument I think that Gannett is making with this offer is that scale is the only way we survive and thrive. Yeah. We've got to be in all these major markets. We have to have as many properties as we can. But what's kind of ironic about that is they're in that position because, as you know from having worked at that company and at Tribune for a while, they, not that long ago, split off all their broadcast properties to make those more profitable looking, and actually Gannett did the same thing. So now we're talking about a newspaper company trying to buy up another newspaper company to develop scale. But it's also ironic because, is scale the right approach, or is localism the right approach? I mean, the folks at Tribune tried to build scale, and one of the reasons there was so much controversy in LA is that they didn't want to allow a local ownership group to take over that paper and focus on the community's needs. So I'm not sure scale is necessarily the answer.
I mean, I agree with you, Mike. I'm not sure scale is the answer. And anyone who knows anything about Gannett is that when they usually come into a market, the amount of content in their newspapers go down. And I think that's what, you know, that people who like the Chicago Tribune, like the LA Times, like the kind of content they get, they're worried about whether or not, if Gannett comes in, whether, you know, they're going to take that same sort of approach.
Those hometown newspapers lose their soul, if you will. And it's interesting because I will admit, in preparing for the show today, I asked if either of you had seen The Wire yet and watched David Simon's series The Wire, and you hadn't. But the final season of that show looks at how the Baltimore police and the media interact. Each season, a different part of society. And one of the things that kept coming out in each of the newspaper scenes throughout that final season was how the local management and the local editors at the Baltimore Sun would rag on Chicago, because the Baltimore Sun had originally been a Times Mirror paper after that merger, and that even in the early to mid 2000s that there was this sentiment in that newspaper's newsroom about how Chicago, meaning Tribune's headquarters there, had come in and kind of stolen the soul of the Baltimore Sun. It would only be likely to happen again if Gannett takes over these Tribune papers.
And I kind of wonder, and some analysts have speculated on whether or not the ultimate goal of Gannett, of the USA Today network, is to keep some of those properties that they really have, I hate to use this word, synergies, like the Florida papers, because Gannett owns a bunch of other Florida papers, and whether they won't sell off, cut loose some of the papers where maybe localism is the right strategy and it's not going to help Gannett. We'll see.
But I mean, Gannett has a history of doing whatever is necessary to keep their stock price up. And if that means they're going to have to jettison some of their properties that they feel are causing that stock price to drop, I think they do it.
Okay, well, you have heard me say this before. There's little I can watch live on TV because as soon as there's a commercial break, I have a tendency to fall asleep. So you better believe it's been a while since I've seen this live.
Live from New York! It's Saturday night. Saturday night! It's Saturday night!
Well, starting in the fall, Saturday Night Live is going to have 30% fewer commercials. But they plan to retain the revenue because they're going to try something a little different. They're going to dip a toe into the branded content pool.
I think this is actually interesting and not all that revolutionary, but it is showing that the folks at SNL and at NBC Universal are at least thinking, what's in it for the future? They have to have a younger audience. SNL's audience, especially among the more preferable audience segment has leveled off, maybe declined a little bit. They have to get younger viewers who are going to do just like you, and the minute a commercial comes on, they're going to be inclined to tune away. The only way that you get people to watch the commercials, maybe, is if they're watching live. And because if they're in the live moment, they're more engaged in the program. There's more opportunities for social media or second screen experiences. There's a way to keep the advertising potentially in front of those folks' eyes. The minute they record it or watch it on demand or whatever, they're skipping right through the commercials.
Yeah, I think to me it's one of those things where they've done this. It's going to be interesting to see how they do it, because I think another way in which at least they were talking about doing it is that for a single advertiser to basically sponsor the entire show for that particular night, which NBC and others have done in their news programming, but now they're moving it more toward entertainment.
Or we see that, this program brought to you with limited interruptions by, like, Better Call Saul or Mad Men was famous for doing that on AMC.
It's kind of like Back to the Future in the old days, when the Camel Caravan sponsored a network news broadcast in some ways, but in another way, this whole sponsored content thing you talked about is really kind of old and new, because here we have a situation where they're saying, 6 times a year for now, Saturday Night Live is going to work with sponsors and allow them to have large segments of the show basically co-created for them. Now, that can be organic and it can be funny or it can flop, but it's certainly not the first company or media company to think about doing this. Lots of print publishers are doing it, but this is a big foray for a network news organization.
To me, it's going to be interesting to see when they do put that together, how the audience responds to that, both the live audience as well as the television audience.
So here's another thought that I had is I was reading about this. I'm of the generation that when it was time for the commercial parodies on SNL, like the first thing I always think of is Colon Blow, because it was about that time that like Cracklin' Oat Bran was a thing. Right. And I kind of have to wonder, because of those commercial parodies, are people going to differentiate? If you're the advertiser who's potentially going into that branded content, is it maybe a dangerous space because of them?
I think that's where the line comes into play. How is the live audience going to react? Okay, is this part of the skit or is this part of the advertising? And the same thing for people who are watching on television. It's going to be interesting to see how they sort of pull that off.
I mean, I have to say, I think the blurring of the lines is probably good for them.
Okay.
I mean, and I go back a few years before you, and I still can remember Bassomatic, like one of the first commercials. But you know, the more that the humor is indistinguishable from either branded content or the skits written by their main writers, the better for them. And I don't think the brands care if they get made fun of. They care that somehow you associate their message and you can share it on social media.
How many years is it later and I'm still talking about Cracklin' Oat Bran and colon?
Well, and I think that's the point that's made. I mean, I think the advertisers are saying we need to figure out some sort of way to reach that audience and engage with them. And if this works, then there you go.
Okay, well, it's been just less than a week since we learned that Prince had died. And for children of the 80s and early 90s, well, he provided the soundtrack for our lives. We dreamed of little red Corvettes. We bopped our heads back and forth with Julia Roberts thinking about Your Extra Time and Your Kiss. And we partied like it was 1999. But if you're looking for his classics, finding them online is going to be harder than you think. And a lot of people found that out the hard way last week. Prince was in constant battle with the record labels, going back and fighting some of the fights we've seen with artists like Taylor Swift, going back to the 80s.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, if you, just this week, Beyonce had her special, her special on HBO, and then she premiered her album Lemonade, and the way in which she did it was pretty much set up.
It was the Prince playbook.
It was the Prince playbook, which when he first started doing that, people criticized him for, but he was really tough on the record labels about maintaining his independence and control over his material, both his written material as well as what he published and when he published it. And I think had it not been for that, many of the artists like Beyonce and others would not be able to do what they're doing right now.
I mean, I agree with that. He clearly was an artist. A lot of people took out of his playbook. But on the other hand, Beyonce did, in addition to have the special on HBO, did release it on a streaming music service put together by Jay-Z and other black artists. So
who's also her husband.
There's an online presence, right? And Prince, on the other hand, he was scrupulous about sending out takedown notices. I mean, his content is not online for the most part. And that was a deliberate change that I don't think we're going to see, continued by artists today.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think today's artists are going to do that because they come from a different generation. But I do think that, it does give them an opportunity to, to take some of what Prince was doing early on and modify it. I think they've done that, and they're going to continue down that road.
I'm really interested to find out what's in his vault and whether or not his executors are going to allow what's in his vault to be released either, I don't know what, on CDs or online or wherever.
I mean, just when you start thinking about it, the fact that he didn't have a will, sort of plays into what you're talking about. How is this actually going to work out? I mean, because there's actually, at least from what we're reading, there's material back to when he first came out that has never been released. And how's that going to play out?
I wonder, too, whether or not the media's coverage of ultimately whatever we find out to be his cause of death is going to affect how Prince is perceived.
Well, we'll find that out. It should come as no big shock that when the news broke of Prince's death last week, the first to break it was TMZ. I've heard people use the term recklessly accurate when describing TMZ. We've had Michael Jackson, we've had Prince. At what point do we as mainstream media begin to look at TMZ differently?
Well, I think part of the, I don't say glamour, but part of what TMZ does that's good is that they have connections. They have people that will tell them information. The bad side to that is that they don't necessarily tell them accurate information all the time. So that's where we start having this, well, it needs to be confirmed by somebody else, because I did hear it first from TMZ, and they said that he died in a plane crash. And then they turned it around and said, well, wait a minute, no, the plane landed.
And that was like a week
sick.
Ago.
Exactly. Yeah. So you start getting...
Or 2 weeks ago, a week before
the whole
he actually died.
speculation part that TMZ deals with makes the credibility issue
How
a
much
problem
of it,
for
Mike,
them.
do you think is that TMZ is paying for tips, and perhaps the media, the mainstream media, isn't going to take TMZ seriously until it chooses to play by the same rules the rest of us do?
I think that is part of it. I mean, but one of the reasons they have this network of tipsters is because they pay them. And yes, that is not the journalistic norm. But I have to also say, I'm not so sure on the few occasions when TMZ messes up that that's qualitatively any different from the few times that legacy and mainstream media screw up. I mean, how many times did they get it right?
Even today, I've seen both Crain's Chicago Business and CNN report that Dennis Hastert wasn't going to be receiving any prison time, both of them reporting it erroneously before the sentencing had been completed, where he is going to be serving 15 months. I mean, that's another example right there.
And let's compare that to what they get right. I mean, Ray Rice, Michael Jackson, Donald Sterling, Mel Gibson, Prince, okay? They and the only difference besides the paying for it is that they're perceived as this sort of tabloidy news service, but they're owned by Time Warner and Turner, the same people that own CNN and a whole bunch of other more established media companies. What's the difference?
And I think part of the issue with their credibility on stories like this is most of their day-to-day coverage is the gossipy kind. So that's what people hear. And so when something big like this breaks, they go like, well, but wait a minute, we need to get some confirmation from the traditional legacy media before we believe it. And then we'll turn around and say, but TMZ broke it first, which is why we're talking about it right now.
On that subject of credibility, if there's one thing that our industry values, it's that our work is our own, that it's original, and that it's produced with integrity. That's why charges of plagiarism cut so deep. Why we tend to shun those, too, who are caught to engage in it. So that's what made what happened to the Daily News' Sean King last week so shocking. Let's rewind to last Tuesday, when the paper published a column written by the criminal justice reporter denouncing the treatment of an Oklahoma man who died in jail. Earlier that day, the Daily Beast, another publication, had published a pretty in-depth article that King's column was drawn from. It was based heavily from the reporting in that story, but the column didn't make any mention of it when it was published. There was no attribution, there was no tip of the hat, there was nothing. It didn't take long for Daily Beast staffers to go public, tweeting King and the Daily News, demanding transparency and literally calling for his head. And it wasn't until later that day on Tuesday, after a journalistic mob went after Sean King, that he included attribution, that he included a block quote, and that his editor was the one who took that out. That editor doesn't work for the Daily News anymore and has taken responsibility for it. What do we know about what may have gone on internally in the investigation on this?
Well, it's kind of weird. I mean, the editor was fired, basically, and in his explanation of what went wrong, he blamed a lot of it on himself by saying that, he didn't pay enough attention to what he was editing out. He didn't pay enough attention as to how he was moving things from email to the content management system of the Daily News, and that led to some of the attribution being taken out. So it's almost as if he's saying, okay, I wasn't paying enough attention and our technology was kind of screwed up.
It's hard to blame a CMS on that.
I know, I agree. And I'm not buying that part of it, but I will say that I think the speed of trying to get information out does play a role in this. But one of the problems I do have is that that King himself should have been reading that before it went out the first time. If you're a columnist and you're putting out this information and you're using information from other people, you want to make sure before it gets out there that everything is correct because your name is on it.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to talk about King and this mob in just a second, but I do agree that any journalist should be reading their own material after it's published, and you would certainly notice if all the attribution was stripped out. Was this on just one story or a couple of stories?
That's the thing.
I mean, the investigation shows that it was more than just a couple of stories.
If he'd have been reading that, as you said, he would have caught it the first time and it would have stopped right then and there. And that's where I have a problem.
And so it makes me wonder who was enabling this editor, who at first only talked about a couple of examples, and what the investigation shows it's several more than a couple. Right. I don't know if we know the total number yet. Was somebody enabling him? Was he a rogue player? Did other parts of the team there kind of play along? All that being said, it still seems to me like there was an awfully bad rush to judgment fueled by social media.
And that's kind of a scary thing here is how it started with the Daily Beast staffers who went after him in an attempt to publicly shame. And then, I don't want to come and make this sweeping generalization, but it then kind of came the industry as a whole, that there's a mob mentality against someone who commits an act of plagiarism.
But we've talked about this on the show often, is that the media can be its own worst critics without having enough information. We just start piling on, and we're basically trying to destroy someone's career over something that I wouldn't say can be easily explained, but at least give the person an opportunity. At least give the person an opportunity to try to explain and say mea culpas, and let's move on to what is really important, and not sit there and just pile on and pretty much try to destroy someone's career.
So I think it's kind of a perfect storm in the worst possible way here. So the Daily Beast journalists, I have no problem with them seeing this and just being outraged and going, what the heck is going on here? On the other hand, you have other media companies who, one, are being too lazy. Why didn't they do a little bit of journalism to find out what was really going on? Two, there have been so many examples of plagiarism that have occurred that there is no justification for it at all. So you tend to think, this probably happened. It's probably true. And third, and I hate to say this about traditional journalists, but they know that retweeting this kind of stuff is going to get them more social media traffic, more page views. And so maybe it doesn't matter that we should do real journalism before we retweet this stuff.
Okay, well, let's change gears a bit and talk about what's gone on with Kelly Ripa and Michael Strahan. It's not going to be long, Strahan. It's not going to be long before you see him on Good Morning America. He's gotten a promotion of sorts from his co-host role at ABC's syndicated program Live with Kelly and Michael. ABC announced the move last week in what seemed like a routine way, to them at least, but management gave his current co-host, Kelly Ripa, only a few minutes' notice, leaving her feeling blindsided. Ripa made little attempt to hide her displeasure. She skipped Wednesday's show and stayed away Thursday and Friday, too. Monday had been a planned day off. So when she returned to the show yesterday, she returned with this.
Our long national nightmare is over. Please, sit down, please, be seated. Look, I'm going to be completely honest. I'm fairly certain that there are trained professional snipers with tranquilizer darts in case I drift too far off message. Okay. I first want to honestly, sincerely thank you for welcoming me back to this show. The love, the show of support through this bizarre time has been really overwhelming. I needed a couple of days to gather my thoughts. After 26 years with this company, I earned the right. And let's be honest, I know half of you called in sick to be here, so we get each other. In that time, I gained some perspective. I always speak from the heart. I didn't want to come out here and just say something I might regret. So what transpired, though, over the course of a few days has been extraordinary in the sense that it started a much greater conversation about communication and consideration, and most importantly, respect in the workplace.
This isn't the first time this happened, Ripa. In 2011, Regis Philbin retired and gave notice to her and the bosses all 20 minutes before he did it on the air. So she had 20 minutes to process that. So maybe there are some communication problems going on there.
It's communication problems on morning television. I mean, you can go back to, Katie Couric. You can go back to Ann Curry and her departure from the Today Show,
which was one of the most mismanaged things we've probably ever seen.
Jane Pauley,
Connie
Chung. The list goes on and on and on.
I have a problem with this because this makes no sense. You knew you were trying to do this. You knew you wanted to move. Why didn't you call her in and say, hey, we're getting ready to make some moves here, and we want to let you in on it? Now, from all the news reports out there, Strahan's agents wanted to keep it quiet. The ABC people wanted to keep it quiet because they wanted to do something big. But she's the person that brought him in. She was the one that helped him get to where he is right now. And for her to be left out of the conversation, it makes no sense to me. It sounds like the good old boys are just saying, hey, we can do whatever we want and we don't really need to talk to you about it.
First and foremost, I think it was all about money, but it was also about sexism. It could be both at the same time. So it's all about money from the standpoint that even though, Live with Kelly and Michael is a real revenue generator for ABC, Good Morning America is a much bigger revenue generator, and their ratings have been flat
And
lately.
now, too, that there's also that fourth hour of the Today Show, that there's also a bit of an effort underway to compete more highly in that fourth hour.
So, it makes sense that ABC is going to say, if we've got a talent that can help us with the show that drives a lot of revenue for the network, then that's what we need to do. On the other hand, the fact that you have almost entirely male executives making these decisions in this instance and in all the instances that Ernest mentioned, you have to see a bit of sexism in that too.
Well, in the sexism or claims of it then escalated even further when she called off and kind of had the sick out going, and that people started to call her behavior diva-like, as opposed to somebody just needing a mental health day after feeling passed over and mistreated by their...
This is the thing that really bothered me. And when you start seeing some of the language that came out, just the headlines from traditional media to entertainment blogs all over, it was all blaming her for her actions, and at the same time using this sort of coded language as if she's somehow an evil person, when in fact she was the one that was disrespected. She was the one who was basically left in the dark, and then all of a sudden they expected her just to show up on the air after hearing that and be all happy and smiling.
Happy, joy, as opposed to taking responsibility for how she was feeling and taking a personal time out, that if somebody else had done that perhaps somebody male, that it may have been seen as a cooling off period and an opportunity to just deal, recover, and come back to work when you can be effective in doing the work.
Right, and even to this day, you still have not gotten a, hey, I'm sorry, we should have done it better from ABC.
I have to say, I agree with everything that's just been said, but I also would, just add a little dose of realism here. Kelly Ripa is still being paid a boatload of money,
in excess of $57,000 a day. And she's doing okay.
And second of all, even though her appearance, and you played a part of that there, seemed very, and was, I'm sure, very heartfelt, it was also heavily scripted. So was Michael Strahan's comments. It was all been vetted by the network people.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, okay. Well, before we go, we have just a little bit of time. I want to talk for a minute and make our audience aware of a new immersive storytelling project underway at the Washington Post. It's an online museum of the Obama administration. The first installment looks at race, at a new aesthetic in the White House, the beer summit, a moment in Selma. And there are going to be another 4 virtual rooms open between now and when Obama leaves office early next year. I know I was kind of excited about this because it's not often we get to see the journalism unroll as the project comes together too.
2 really quick things. One, I'd say this is a great opportunity to try to figure out a way to monetize archives. And second of all, look at this link from our links blog on your mobile phone, and you'll see how it's been optimized for that.
Yeah, I actually like the stories. I read the first story that came with it, and it really gave a opening line that really helps people understand how transformative Obama's presidency has been.
Puts his legacy into context.
Yes,
well, we are pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. It's under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to the program again. Leave us comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Thanks to Travis McMillan for directing today's show, Maya Jackson, Kyle Felling, Chelsea Vaughn.